Okay, welcome to this Skills for Bees Cymru talk. This talk is an introduction to bumblebees for people who are completely new to this group of insects, or for people who would like to revise their knowledge a little bit. My name is Clare Flynn and I'm the project officer for Skills for Bees Cymru. It is a 3-year project ending in 2024 and we are working across Wales to increase people's knowledge about bumblebees, particularly identifying them to species and recording their bumblebee sightings. And the aim is for this increase in bumblebee data holdings in Wales to give us more information on how our bumblebees are doing, and also to help us in decisions about how we conserve them into the future. So I'll just show you a little bit about what we're going to be covering. So the talk will cover a bit about bumblebee background, why these insects are so special and interesting, and why they're so popular. A little bit about their ecology and their life cycle. Bumblebee basics, we'll look a bit more closely at them, at their structure and their anatomy. And we will take a look at the 8 most common species which occur in Wales and indeed across the rest of the UK. And we'll look a little bit about how we can get involved in helping bumblebee conservation and looking after the future really for these particular insects. So yeah, sit back and enjoy. So first of all, a little bit of background. So bees in the UK fall into one of 3 groups. There are about 275 species in total, and this number fluctuates slightly because the solitary bees in particular, some years it may be that we lose species occasionally, or new species are recorded, which does often happen as new species migrate from mainland Europe. So the number is slightly fluid, but our bee fauna in the UK basically falls into the solitary bees, honeybees and the bumblebees, of which tonight is the focus. So if we look at honeybees, there is 1 species in the UK, Apis mellifera, and it is largely a domesticated insect. We do have feral colonies which may take up residence, for example, in holes in trees or roof spaces, and they may persist for several years away from the hives. But largely it is domesticated animal, obviously, that we farm for honey production. Honeybees are social, living in a colony with a queen and her female workers. So they have quite complex behaviour within those social colonies, and they are quite distinct in the bee world for having a barbed sting. So that story that lots of people know, where bees die after they've stung you, it's only actually true of honeybees, because the barbed sting means that the sting remains in your skin as the bee pulls away, often fatally harming that individual bee. Honeybees are also what we call corbiculate. They have corbicula. This is these flattened areas on the hind leg. The hind tibia is specially adapted, flattened and hairless and shiny, in order to carry a lump of sticky pollen that's been mixed by the bee with nectar. And you'll often see them out and about with big pollen loads on their hind legs. So the scientific word for that is corbicula, pollen baskets. And another sort of very special thing about honeybees is that they make honey, obviously, and this allows them, it allows the whole colony to survive a temperate winter by feeding on the honey that they've made during the flowering season. So quite special insects, and obviously very important to us as humans. Okay, solitary bees in the UK and the world actually make up by far the greatest diversity and number of bee species, with most of our UK bees being actually falling into the solitary bee group. As their name suggests, they're different to honeybees and bumblebees in that females work alone to build their nest and provision their young with food. There are a few exceptions within the solitary bee group, but this is generally true. They're largely wild species, though some solitary bees are particularly effective at pollinating fruit trees. So you can have instances where nests are set up in orchards to facilitate fruit pollination. They have a smooth sting, so they don't die when they sting you, though in many of these species the sting is too small to actually penetrate human skin, but in some it definitely does, which I can speak from experience. Solitary bees don't have the pollen baskets or corbicula on the hind legs, but instead they have pollen carrying hairs called scopa, which can occur depending on species on different parts of the bee. Could be on their legs, just under the legs where they join the body, under the abdomen. Lots and lots of variety in where the scopal hairs occur. And they don't make honey as such, and the adults don't survive the winter. So for most of this group of species, the bee species survives our winter by overwintering in the nest within the pupal stage and then emerging as an adult the following year. Okay. So bumblebees, the focus of our talk this evening. There are 24 species in the UK. And that's 18 social species and 6 cuckoo species, which I will come back to. But the majority are social insects living in a colony, a little bit like a honeybee, with a queen and her daughter workers. And the queen is the reproductive individual within the colony. Most bumblebee colonies in the UK are wild, although we do actually import captive bred bumblebees. There's a big factory in the Netherlands that produces these captive bred bumblebees, and they are used in glass houses for early set fruit, for example, for commercial pollination. But all the species we have are native to the UK. They have a smooth sting like the solitary bees, so they can survive to sting again. But like the honeybees, if you look at this image on the top left hand side, you can see this triangular section in the hind leg of this bumblebee queen, and that again is the pollen basket or corbicula where she carries her sticky pollen lump. And the strategy for bumblebees in surviving the winter is for the queens to hibernate alone, which I'll come to in more detail shortly. So not the colony doesn't survive, most of the colony dies off, and the young queens hibernate alone and emerge in the spring to start a new colony. There are increasing incidences of bumblebee queens starting new nests in the autumn and actually missing out hibernation, especially in the south of England where the climate is a bit warmer and there's lots of garden shrubs and things to feed on through the winter. So we are seeing more instances of hibernation being skipped as our winters become milder. Okay, so going on in a little bit more detail now for our 24 bumblebee species in the UK. As I said just now, we basically split our 24 species into two groups. We've got 18 species of social bumblebee, as I explained, who live with a queen and her daughter workers, which help her tend the nest and feed the young and etc. But we also have 6 species of what we call cuckoo bumblebees. And these 6 species have evolved a slightly different life history. And they basically flaunt those rules. And what happens with the cuckoo bumblebees, there is no separation of the females into queens and workers. We simply have males and females. All the females are rather large, a bit like queens. And what they do is they will attack the nest of a social bumblebee. They tend to be quite host specific, so certain cuckoo bumblebee species attack particular social bumblebee species, and they will try and subdue the queen of the social nest and either expel her from the nest or actually kill her. And then the cuckoo female takes over the nest, complete with all of the workers from the original species, the social species, and she uses those workers to raise her own young. So she acts just like the cuckoo bird, basically, and utilises all the hard work of the host species to raise her own young. Cuckoos aren't harmful at a population level to our social species because they exist at much lower numbers in any particular geographic area, so that they exist in a balance of numbers, if you like, between the cuckoos and their hosts. And they're actually really, really impressive to see in the wild. The cuckoo bumblebee females particularly are big and stunning, and they are actually built for sort of fighting and being quite fierce, so that they're very large and beautiful insects, and very interesting to watch. Okay, so our bumblebees are known for their pollination services, and they actually are critical pollinators, not only of our wildflowers and trees and maintaining a lot of the landscape as we know it, but they're obviously incredibly important pollinators of many of our commercial crops as well. There are many insect pollinators in the UK. It isn't just bumblebees, and indeed not just bees. But bumblebees are particularly important because they're such effective pollinators for many different reasons. And because of their commercial value, as well as their intrinsic value, their intrinsic wildlife value, this commercial value and the fact that they have suffered such declines has caused a lot of interest to be generated in them in the last sort of couple of decades or so. Crops like tomatoes, actually bumblebees are the primary pollinators because they carry out the very special buzz pollination which some plants require to effectively set fruit. But many of our other crops as well, peas and beans with their deep flowers, bumblebees are particularly attracted to these types of plant. So yeah, they are really, really important for many, many different reasons. And the plight of the bumblebee, has been heightened both in academic research, in agriculture, and in wider public engagement for quite a while now, and hence the formation of the Bumblebee Conservation Trust itself over 10 years ago. As well, I'm sure many of you watching this will be aware that there have been many changes in our countryside, pretty much since the end of the Second World War, when farming methods changed drastically from small-scale farms and fields with hay meadows and herbal lays, etc., to larger fields, fewer hedgerows, and large areas of single crops or silage, for example, where we live in Wales. And these changes really did affect so much of our wildlife, and still affect much of our wildlife. There's been catastrophic declines in many species of plants, insects, birds, mammals. And of course, bumblebees are no different. The reduction in flowering plants across our landscape basically took away food. Reduction in hedgerows took away nesting and hibernation places. And as a result, research from the 1980s onwards showed that many of our bumblebee species in the UK had suffered significant declines. Okay, so before we go on to look at some of the bumblebees that are still doing well across our countryside, we'll have a little bit of information now on some more specific aspects of bumblebee ecology. And we're going to start off with the bumblebee year. Knowing how bumblebees behave throughout the year and throughout the seasons is not only really interesting in itself, but if you want to start identifying bumblebees, it's really useful to understand the bumblebee annual life cycle. So basically, that little image there on the left shows you a bumblebee queen emerging from hibernation in the spring. Now, when bumblebee queens emerge in the spring, they have already mated the autumn before, or the summer before, I should say, and they're able to carry that sperm with them basically until they need it. And when they emerge, they're hungry. So there we've got illustrated some willow catkins, and that willow catkins are one of the plant species that are a fantastic source of pollen and nectar in the early spring for our emerging bumblebees. It's a really nice thing if you can, if you've got room for catkin bearing willow in your garden, really great one for bumblebees. And she emerges and she will feed up on that very nutritious pollen, which is full of protein and lots of nutrients, and the energy giving sugary nectar. Other plants include crocus and lungwort, pulmonaria, flowering currant. All of these things are good for spring emerging bumblebees, winter heathers as well. And she will also look for a nest site. So that illustrates a bumblebee within her nest. Now, where they nest depends a little bit on species, but it could be things like mammal holes in scrubby bits of grass or at the base of hedges. Some bumblebees like to nest sort of up airily in something like a nest box. But basically, you will see in the spring, you'll see bumblebee queens flying over the ground, zigzagging around, looking for nest sites. So it's very typical queen behaviour when you see them doing that. And when she's found her nest site, she will make it nice and cosy. And there you can see this bumblebee sitting on this little ball of pollen and nectar into which she lays her first batch of eggs. And this here represents a little wax cup that bumblebee queens will make to have near them. She'll position herself near to the cup. She'll fill this with regurgitated nectar, and then she can use that to sustain herself as she sits on and broods the eggs, a little bit like a bird really, keeping them warm. So really amazing behaviour for these little insects, and she does this all alone. And while she's doing that as well, she may leave the nest to collect more pollen and nectar. And then her first batch of workers will hatch as grubs and eat the pollen and nectar she's provided. And eventually, after a couple of weeks or so, they will pupate and eventually the adult worker bees will emerge from their cocoons, and these will all be female. So these will be the queen's daughters. They will be smaller than her. The size can vary with the workers very much, depending on how much they've eaten as larvae. But once they emerge and they go out into the outside world, the queen will then remain in the nest, laying eggs and increasing the size of the colony. So through the summer, they're out and about, feeding from all the lovely summer flowers, collecting pollen to feed to their new sisters, and drinking nectar to sustain themselves as well. And they will tend the nests, they'll recycle some of the wax cells for reuse, and feed the new larvae as they hatch. And the nest will grow in size. Depending on the species, sometimes there might be up to about a couple of hundred workers, but there might be less for some species. So they're busy, busy, busy through the summer, and then towards the end of the nest cycle, changes occur within the nest and the queen will start to lay eggs, which won't now turn into worker daughters, but instead will turn into male bumblebees and new young daughter queens. When they hatch, the males will leave the nest, never to return. So they don't go back to the nest. They'll go off to find patches to patrol, to look for queens of the same species from other nests. And the new daughter queens, they will be going off and hoping to find a mate. Sometimes they might return to the old nest for shelter and food. But once they've mated here, as you can see in this illustration, hopefully with a male from another nest, she will then start to feed up, ready to hibernate, and the cycle begins to come to an end. And right at the end, the old colony will gradually die off. The old queen, the males, the workers will all die off. But with a bit of luck and with the right conditions and with enough food, the new queens will find a suitable hibernation place and sleep through the winter in order to start the process again. So late season forage, if you're a keen gardener, things like knapweed and verbena, etc., are so important for the males and also for the queens as they feed up to go into hibernation. So that's the bumblebee year, and with that we can sort of learn a little bit more about each stage and be aware of what we're seeing in our gardens or nature reserves at any one time, or parks or towns, wherever bumblebees occur. So from that, the queens, they emerge from hibernation in the spring. So you will see queens in the springtime, as I've said, often showing nest searching behaviour or feeding up on things like willow. But you will see another generation of queens at the end of the colony cycles later in the summer as well, as the new daughter queens emerge. They're generally relatively large compared to other bumblebees you'll see in the summer, although it does vary slightly with species. They'll have quite distinctive, shiny, flattened hind tibia. They're pollen baskets, which are really noticeable in the queens. You can see that when they're sort of shiny. They tend to be really bright and well marked, and for that reason, it's a good point to start with your identification skills. And as I've said, they may be seen nest searching in the spring. Okay, so some contrast with the workers. They're often smaller versions of the queens, though not always, but mostly for a particular species. They're seen in increasing numbers through the spring and summer as colonies grow, and you'll have, you know, quite high numbers of workers within any one colony. All the females, all the workers are female, I should say, with pollen baskets, and they all sting. They generally have quite busy, flighty behaviour because they have a lot to do. They're working for the colony, so they're collecting food, they're keeping themselves going with their nectaring. They might be tending the colony, keeping it cool, protecting it, etc. Workers within any one colony may vary in size depending on the stage in the annual colony cycle. Sometimes workers that are produced at the beginning are smaller because they've been fed less, so they might vary in size. And towards the end of their life, they might appear very faded and raggedy because they have worked so hard and they get quite battered. They can often lose their hair as they're going in and out of the next nest and have a bald spot there on the thorax, and they can often lose their colour or get raggedy wings. So yeah, the workers are very interesting to observe because they are so busy and have quite a lot of different types of behaviour. And then the males. Males are seen really increasing numbers from early summer onwards. The early bumblebee males are the first to see, which I'll show you later, and they come out sort of towards the end of May. Males have quite different behaviour from the workers. They appear lazier because their primary function is to find a queen and to keep themselves going by drinking a lot of nectar. So you'll often see them sitting on flowers. They might be within a group of males, nectaring on flowers, particularly some of the composites such as knapweed. Their legs don't have the pollen baskets on the tibia, on the hind legs, so their legs tend to appear more spindly, and they don't have the shininess on the hind tibia either. They often are fluffier than females of the same species. You can see this male here of a red-tailed bumblebee. The hairs across parts of its body are actually quite long. The females look more velvety and neatly clipped. Males have longer antennae in all species, and this can be quite noticeable. This is something we practice on our field skills, getting your eye in to see the more droopy and longer antennae of the males. And males, although they can appear very bright when they emerge because they're often quite colourful, that because they never go back to the nest and they're often in the sun for long periods of time, they fade really quickly, which can hamper us when we're trying to identify them. Also, 4 of our common species have lovely bright yellow facial hair, which you don't get in female bumblebees. So they have a really nice patch of obvious yellow facial hair. So if you see a bumblebee with lots of yellow hair on its face, then you're pretty sure that it is a male, which I will come back to. Okay, so we'll have a look at how bumblebees are made. We'll have a look at their anatomy at a basic level. They are insects, and like all insects, they have 3 body sections, which is the head, thorax and abdomen. They have 3 pairs of legs and 2 pairs of wings, unlike flies, for example, which only have 1 pair of wings. Bees have 2 pairs, which hook together into a single membrane when they fly. So this is the basic anatomy. You've got your 3 sections with the head at the front. The thorax is the middle section. and then the abdomen is the large rear section. There is a waist, a bit like a wasp, in the middle between the thorax and the abdomen, but it's hard to see in bumblebees because they are so fluffy. And then you've got the sting, only in females. Males don't have stings at all in any bee because it is evolved from an egg-laying tube. So males don't have the equipment to sting. You have the pollen baskets on the hind legs, and of course the antenna there on the head. So in an actual bumblebee, there we have the thorax, the middle section there, the head at the front, and we have a little constricted waist under all that hair, and then the abdomen at the back. I should say as well, the legs and the wings come off the thorax. And that's kind of the powerhouse of the bumblebee, if you like. Underneath all that hair, when bumblebees go bald, which they occasionally do, and they're very, very worn, the integument, which is like the exoskeleton, is all black. So once a bumblebee starts to go really bald, it is very, very difficult to tell species apart, especially if their remaining hair is faded. So yeah, this poor bumblebee here is looking a bit worse for wear, but it does show us, yeah, that black integument underneath the colourful hair. Okay, so when we start to identify bumblebees, we do use the vocabulary of head, thorax and abdomen to talk about the colour banding and the patterns that we see on the bumblebee. But there are insects out there that look incredibly similar and have the same body parts and actually have evolved to mimic bumblebees. And here we have two photographs taken on the same plant, Cotoneaster, in Pembrokeshire on the same summer's day. And you can see that these two insects look very similar. If you have done bee spotting before, you can hopefully tell which one of these is a bumblebee and which one isn't. If you're completely new, superficially, these two insects can be easily mistaken and confused for each other in the field. What we actually have here is a hoverfly on the left, a harmless hoverfly, and a bumblebee on the right. The hoverfly is a species called Volucella bombolans, which is a brilliant bumblebee mimic. And you can see it mimics almost perfectly the bumblebee. Sorry, the hoverfly on the left mimicking the bumblebee on the right with the same colour patterns, the same yellow and the white tail. So when you're starting out doing field work and identifying bumblebees, getting your eye in for separating out mimics from the bumblebees themselves is almost like a first stage, asking yourself, is it actually a bee? And again here, this time we've got the bumblebee on the left and the hoverfly on the right. There are quite a lot of differences when you look closely. The bumblebee is much more chunky. The legs are wider. You can see the fly is slimmer. It's a finer body structure with more spindly legs. But the real critical difference is really around the head. And if you were netting and putting these insects, you would soon see the bumblebee head has very, very distinctive, quite robust looking antennae. And its compound eyes, although big, like the flies, they are very much on the side of the bee's head. You can see here in the picture, they're on the side with a big space in between. And then these three ocelli, which are primitive sort of eyes, light detecting organs there in the middle, in this big gap. You look at this diagram of a simplified head of a fly, of a hoverfly. The compound eyes are much rounder, much bigger, and almost meet in the middle, with the ocelli in a very small gap comparatively. Also, the antennae you can see on the picture are very indistinct in the field and contrast markedly from the bees' chunky antennae. So you soon get your eye in on the differences between these bumblebee mimics, the hoverflies, and the bumblebees themselves. Just really focusing on the head. We also, once we know we have a bee and not a fly, we then have to make sure it is a bumblebee and not a solitary bee or a honeybee, and this comes with experience. Honeybees, they're up on the right, the top right, that is a typical honeybee worker. They do vary slightly in colouring on the abdomen here. They can sometimes be quite a lot darker, but pretty much honeybee workers always look like this, and this is mostly what you will see because the males and queens are far less often observed in the field. And then on the left here, we actually have a solitary bee. One of the few species that does look quite bumblebee-like, but you can see this solitary bee, these very long hairs on its legs. You wouldn't see that on a bumblebee to that extent. And this yellow face, you do get bumblebees with yellow hairs on their face, but this is actually the integument coloured yellow, and you wouldn't get that in a bumblebee either. But that just comes with some experience, and you soon get to notice the bumblebees as being distinct from some of the bigger solitary bees. And that is actually a male hairy-footed flower bee, which is a solitary bee. And then the middle one is a bumblebee, sort of more rounded, very, very furry. The integument is always black all over. And the honeybee there on the top right. Okay. So once you have an individual bee and you know it's not a hoverfly and you're fairly confident it's a bumblebee, what my project Skills for Bees Cymru aims to do is to help people build their confidence in identifying bumblebees to species and caste. So whether you have a male or a female, a queen or a worker. And we actually use like a little palette, if you like, of clues and information to help us to be as confident as we can with our species identification. So we use tail colour, and a lot of the Bumblebee Conservation Trust resources start with separating species based on their tail colour. The banding, so do they have yellow stripes, for example? In this case, there is no banding on this particular example, which would be a clue in itself. The colour of the facial hair, which I've already mentioned, in some of the males you get the bright yellow, so that helps us to narrow down whether it's male or female. The shape of the legs, so do the bees have pollen baskets or not? Again, helping us whether it's male or female, and that also can help when we're identifying cuckoo bees. How long the antennae are. In the males, they're longer, as I've already mentioned. And we can also use clues to help us, such as the behaviour they're showing. For example, is it showing nest searching behaviour? Could it be a queen? And seasonality. When in the year are you seeing it? Because if it's really early in March or April, it's very unlikely to be a male, or very unlikely to be a late emerging species. So we use a whole suite of clues to help inform our understanding of identification. Okay, so now I'm going to introduce you to the common species that we find in the UK and in Wales. No different. So this graphic, if you like, this leaflet is available on our website as part of our Be the Change resources. So do go to the Bumblebee Conservation Trust website and you can actually download this really useful guide to our common 8 species. I shan't go through all that detail now, but I have got slides on each one of these individual species. But basically, out of our 24, these are the 8 that have survived many of the detrimental changes that we've seen, primarily habitat loss, in the last few decades. The 6 cuckoo bumblebees that we have in the UK still remain quite widespread, though they are quite scarce in number. And our remaining species, most of them have actually suffered quite big declines in abundance, and many of them only occur in very restricted ranges now in the UK. So when you start looking at bumblebees and start going out and about into the countryside or parks or your garden, the chances are you will see one of these 8, and the chances of seeing most of the others are fairly slim, unless you go to very particular places or very particular habitats. So we'll go through these 8 now in a little bit of detail so that you can begin to learn to identify them. So here we have queens of our common 8 species, and like I said earlier, queens are really nice to start to learn to identify because they're quite big. They tend to have all their colours nice and bright. You rarely see them when they're all faded and raggedy. So they're quite simple. There are less pitfalls in identifying the queens, if you like. And we have up here, we'll start with the buff-tail queen here. The buff-tail bumblebee has a buff-coloured tail, as its name suggests, so never a snowy white tail, and 2 often deep yellow, almost marmalade-y orange stripes, one on the thorax behind the head, if you remember that middle section, and one on the abdomen here, and then that buff-coloured tail. And the buff-tailed bumblebee is really common, and it is one of the first to emerge in the spring. It's the one that lots of people are familiar with, that you see quartering over the ground in a really loud buzz, with a really loud buzz in the spring. They tend to be very large and noticeable. And then next there on the right, we have the white-tailed bumblebee. Similar pattern to the buff-tail and similar size as well, a kind of big chunky bee, this one, generally speaking. But the queens of the white-tail always do have a snowy white tail and never this buff sort of dirty white appearance. And their stripes, although in the same position as the buff-tail, they tend to be more lemon. So if you like, the white is whiter and the brights are brighter in the white-tailed bumblebee. Okay, moving across, the red-tailed bumblebee here, beautiful bee, really quite common and I think really stunning. It has a beautiful bright red tail up to about 1/3 of the abdomen, but no yellow bands in the queen. Okay, so that's the red-tailed bumblebee. There are a couple of rare species that look very similar, but this is the one you're most likely to see. If it looks like that, it's most likely to be a red-tailed bumblebee. And then moving across, the early bumblebee, a relatively small species compared to the others, and the queens tend to be smaller than other queens. It's a very pretty species, and it does have a red tail, but it's just the tip. It doesn't go so far up the abdomen as in this species, the red tail, so it's just a tip, an orangey tip, and then 2 lovely bright yellow stripes in the queen. So that's the early bumblebee, and as its name suggests, it is quite early emerging, sort of around about the same time as the buff-tail. Down here on the left, so move to the bottom left, we have the garden bumblebee. This is also white-tailed, although the white tail isn't showing in that picture because it's in flight. But there are two things about this bumblebee which make it distinctive. One is that it actually has 3 yellow stripes. The first one on the thorax is behind the head, and then it's a bit difficult to see, but it actually has a second yellow stripe at the back of the thorax, and then a third one at the top of the abdomen, which meets the one on the thorax. So it's almost like it has 2 yellow stripes either side of its waist. But the thing that really distinguishes it from all of the others is its exceptionally long and relatively narrow face. Because the garden bumblebee has a really long tongue compared to other species, and it needs this long face to house the tongue when it's rolled up. So it has a horsey face. Okay, moving on to the Heath bumblebee. Not quite as widespread as the others, but as this is a talk for a Welsh audience, if you are near some hills or mountains and the uplands or coastal heath, the Heath bumblebee loves heather. So it's very closely associated with heathlands. Like the garden bumblebee, it has 1, 2, 3 yellow stripes on a white bottom, but it doesn't have, it's distinguished from the garden bumblebee by not having that long face, and it also tends to be smaller and fluffier. Okay, I will come back to all of these in a sec. So moving across, we have our common carder bumblebee, which is our only common ginger bumblebee. But even though we think of this sometimes, it can be very variable and actually have quite a lot of black on it, both on the abdomen and sometimes on the thorax, and it is actually quite creamy underneath. Okay, very common in gardens, and it tends to persist late into the year. And it quite likes deep flowered plants like clovers and vetches, quite a long tongue as well. And then last but not least, the tree bumblebee. This one only came into the UK in around 2001, I think it was. It came over as a natural colonisation from continental Europe. And this bumblebee is very distinctive. It has a gingery thorax, which can make it look superficially like the common carder. But it then has a wide band of black on its abdomen with a tail of snowy white. And this is the one that you get most often nesting in bird boxes. Okay, so those are our 8 common species, and these are queens of those species to really get you started. So really sort of beautiful examples of each one. So we'll go into those now in a little bit more detail. We'll start with the buff-tail. So up here on the top, we have a diagrammatic representation of each caste of the species. So the male, the worker and the queen. And this is to just give you an idea of colour and pattern. All species have variation within them, but this gives you sort of the basic form of each of the species. And we'll use some photographs just to go along with those. So this is a queen buff-tail. They're big, they're bold, they're noisy, very beautiful. And like I said before, sort of buff, dirty, off-white tail and really, really rich, deep yellow, almost orangey stripes. And they can appear quite dark. The workers are very similar to their mothers, but their tails can often be quite snowy white, sometimes with a little bit of buff there at the interface. of the tail with the black band, but they generally are a little bit lighter and brighter than the queens. And the males are very, very similar in this species to the workers. So males and workers, very similar and very difficult to tell apart. It's something that we practice on our field skills. You know, this talk is really only to give you an introduction, and I will be offering more detailed ID talks in 2022. So the white-tailed bumblebee, from our diagram there, you can see the queens and the workers are very similar, other than size, but the male in this species is distinctive. It's one of the species where the males have a really lovely yellow-haired face. So the pictures bear this out. So the queen there of the white-tailed bumblebee, similar to the buff-tail, but lighter, brighter, with a beautiful snowy white tail. Workers, this one here covered in pollen, and you can see she's got a beautiful snowy white tail. Very hard to tell apart from a buff-tail worker if the buff-tail worker also has a white tail. So we often don't try to tell the workers apart because it can be very, very challenging in the field. But the males in the white-tailed bumblebee, Bombus leucorum, are distinctive. They have a lot more yellow on them than the females. It can vary quite a lot within this species, but generally if you see a bumblebee with a white tail and then sort of extended bands of yellow, extensive collar around the head and a yellow face, we are looking at a white-tailed male, and you can see he's got extra bands of yellow there on the thorax and at the top of the abdomen. Okay, so though the male is really distinctive, the queen is distinctive, but the worker is difficult to tell from a buff-tail worker. So the garden bumblebee, another white-tailed species, but this time, rather than two bands, as in buff-tails and white-tails, the garden bumblebee, which is really common, has 3 yellow bands on all 3 casts. The pattern is the same on the queen, the worker and the male. They have a yellow band, a collar behind the head, a second yellow band at the back of the thorax, which can be a bit tricky to see, and a third yellow band right at the top of the abdomen where it meets the thorax. And the other thing they have is that long face. So the garden bumblebee, there you are, the queens and workers are the same other than size. And you can see what I mean by that long face there. That was actually taken in my garden. And this is a queen. You can see her very obvious pollen basket there, and 1, 2, 3 yellow bands. Okay, and that's most of the photographs, I should say, they're either Stephen Fawkes or mine, and they're credited as such where appropriate. I should have mentioned that. But this male, which is one of Stephen's photographs, so this is the garden bumblebee, and like his sisters and his mother, he has 1, 2, 3 yellow bands and a white tail. It looks as though the tail is striped because you can see the black integument shining through. It's quite an elongate species, and sometimes you do get this kind of banding effect on the tail. But the faces in the males are long as well in the garden bumblebee, Bombus hortorum. And the Heath bumblebee is very similar in pattern to the garden bumblebee, but as I said before, it's more restricted in habitat. So you're likely only to see this on patches of heathland where there is heather for them to feed on, but they have that same 1, 2, 3 bands and a white tail, but their face isn't elongate like this in the garden bumblebee. It's almost sort of heart-shaped. It's much more round. and when you begin to get familiar with this species, it's actually my favourite UK species. It's small, relatively small, quite rounded and quite fluffy in appearance compared to the garden bumblebee as well. Very attractive little species. The queens and workers appear very similar other than size, but the males, the diagram doesn't represent really truthfully how much yellow is on the males. This one just has a tiny little patch on the face, but you can see it's variable. And this one is almost completely yellow with a white tail. So male Bombus genellus, the Heath bumblebee, you are looking for more yellow than the females have. So there's a little bit of difference between the males and females, and primarily seen on heather. Okay, moving on to another white-tailed species, but quite different from the ones we've looked at so far. No yellow bands, and the tree bumblebee is incredibly distinctive with this gingery, tawny coloured thorax, black. The majority of the abdomen is black, and then the tail is white. And again, queens, workers and males are all the same. So queens and workers, this is one of Stephen Falk's pictures. Queens and workers look like this. Very, very beautiful species actually. And again, the males are similar, well, same pattern as their mothers and sisters. I should point out on this one here, you can see the beginnings of the bald patch where she's been going in and out of the nest. So you can see the black integument shining through. But we do have quite commonly in this species a melanic form where the gingery thorax is almost all entirely black. You can see a tiny bit of the reddy ginger still persisting there on this one. But this melanic form is relatively frequent, and this picture was actually sent to me by somebody who'd taken this in their garden, but you can still see it has the distinctive white tail. Okay, so do look out for these forms if you have a tree bumblebee nest in your garden. And the common carder bumblebee, Bombus pascorum, it's our only common ginger bumblebee. There are other very, very similar species in the UK, but they are all relatively scarce and in some cases very rare. But Bombus pascorum, the common carder, really is very, very widespread, and you will definitely see this once you start getting into bumblebee identification. They tend to like deeper tubed flowers, and like I said earlier, they persist into the late summer. The queens, workers and males all look similar, but there can be variety within all of them. There is variation in this species, and the variation can be largely down to how much black hair is mixed in with the ginger. So some individuals can have a lot of black hair within the thorax. They can have a lot of black hair mixed in on the abdomen, but there is pretty much always some black hair on the sides of the abdomen in this species. And the abdomen can appear quite striped or very dark. The males emerge later on in the summer, and they can often look quite bright and golden when they emerge. But you can see the spindly legs of that male there and his long droopy antenna. So very common, but quite a variable species, but almost always with noticeable black on the sides of the abdomen mixed in with their ginger hairs. Okay, so that's the common carder bumblebee. Right, so our last two of our common 8. The first is the penultimate one, if you like, is the early bumblebee. A very attractive, relatively small bumblebee in the UK compared to the other species. And there are differences here between all three castes. So the queen, as we saw in our queen photographs earlier, has a little orangey red but quite noticeable tip to the tail, to the abdomen, with two very beautiful bright yellow stripes. I should say this is quite a fluffy species as well, a bit like the Heath bumblebee. So the queen is very bright and they emerge quite early in the year, sort of often March time. The workers in this species can be quite variable, and many of them do not have that second yellow band like their mothers. So unlike most workers, they're not little miniatures of the queen. They'll often lack that second yellow band, or there will just be a few yellow hairs on the top of the abdomen there. And they can be incredibly small, the workers of this species. Like I say, size can vary, but they do tend to be some of our smallest bumblebees that we observe. So look out for them, a teeny, teeny dash of orange on the tail, and then perhaps one yellow stripe or band behind the head. And you can see she's got lovely pollen load there, and she's actually nectar robbing from this flower, sticking her tongue in a hole there to reach the nectar in the base of the flower. And then the males in this species are different again, and they are one of the common species where males have their yellow moustaches, if you like, their yellow facial hair. So when they come out, like this one, which I photographed in Pembrokeshire at the end of May, absolutely beautiful, lots and lots of yellow, like a ruff around his head, much more than in the females, lovely yellow haired face and lots of yellow on his abdomen as well. So very stunning, but the amount of yellow on the males does vary a little bit. So just beware, they might not appear quite as yellow as that one. Okay, so that's the early bumblebee, Bombus pretorum. And then last but not least, we have the red-tailed bumblebee, Bombus lapidarius. And you can see from the diagram, the workers and queens are the same in pattern and colour. So red tails covering about a third of the abdomen with no banding. But the males, again, they're one of our yellow mustachioed male species, and they also have a yellow collar and a little second yellow band there on the thorax, but no yellow on the abdomen generally. So the queens and workers look very similar other than size, and the queens of this species can reach quite a considerable size. And here we have two of Stephen's images here of the males, and you can see there where the males differ from the females in having these yellow collars and fluffy yellow faces, with a dash of yellow there just at the back of the thorax as well. So not as yellow as the males of the early bumblebee, not quite so much on yellow on the males of the red tail. Okay, so that is a bit of a whistle-stop introduction to our common 8 species, but there are lots and lots of resources out there to help you, because it's impossible to remember all of the detail with these species. So do have a look on the Bumblebee Conservation Trust website. We've got lots of identification resources on there. We've also got our trust book, which is a really lovely book. It's perfect for beginners. It covers all of our British bumblebee species, and it's a lovely background book, but it also is a great identification guide as well, with lots of really good photographs. And it can be found on our website and also on Amazon, and it's only £10, so it's really good value. Stephen Falk, whose pictures I've used for a lot of this talk, his book, The Field Guide to Bees of Great Britain and Ireland, actually has all of our British bee species in. It's a fantastic book, so it has all the solitary bees as well, and it has a really good scientific key. It may be a little bit of a big step for a complete beginner, but it's really, really good if you've got to grips with some of your bumblebees and you want to go on to that next stage and find out more. There's also our Bumblebee Conservation Trust app. What's that, Bumblebee? If you go onto the App Store or Google Play, it's available for all devices, Android and Apple. Look for the blue square with the bumblebee icon. It's free and it's really, really good. It covers just the 8 common species, so you don't get confused with all the rare ones. And it's really, really intuitive and simple to use. So I really, really recommend that as a helpful tool if you have a smartphone and enjoy using apps. Okay, so right at the beginning, I mentioned my project, Skills for Bees Cymru, and the focus of my project is improving our data holdings for all our bumblebee species across Wales. And we can only do that by relying on people to record bumblebees and submit their data. I will be doing a talk in 2022 purely on recording and submitting data. But basically, there are several ways you can do that. You can set up a bee walk monitoring transect, and I've put the link to our website where you can find out more about the bee walk monitoring scheme there, which is a really well designed citizen science scheme, and I will be offering more training on that in coming months. You can submit individual sightings of bumblebees into, well, there's 2 key ways of doing it. You can either put them into iRecord, for which there is an app, and that's the UK-wide recording system, or you can submit your records to the Welsh local record centres, who also have an app called which is bilingual, called the Lurk Wales app, which is really fantastic and easy to use, and it's free. Both the apps are free, and either of those methods result in your records going basically to the same place, into the national database, and they are verified by a team of experts. So like I said, I will be doing another talk on that in early 2022 to give you a lot more information and advice on those ways of recording bumblebees. Okay, so more generally, if recording and identification isn't for you, or you just want other ways you can get involved, we have a lot of information on gardening on the Bumblebee Conservation Trust website, and I've put the web address there. We've got a brilliant tool called Be Kind, which helps you to rate your garden's attractiveness and usefulness for bumblebees. And we've got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of suggestions in our interactive Be Kind tool, which will give you plant suggestions for all sorts of gardens and climates and soil types. So do have a look at that. We're also keen to get more people joined as volunteers, not joined as volunteers, sorry, joined as members. I think our membership is about £30 a year, and there's all sorts of things that we offer through membership, and of course you're directly supporting the trust by doing that. So do have a look if you're interested in joining. We have volunteers who fundraise. These are some of our Wales volunteers fundraising up near Barry Island, which, you know, all of that goes to help fund our conservation of our bumblebee species in Wales and the UK. And because this talk is going out near to Christmas, we have lots of gift memberships for a really nice and sort of positive and useful Christmas gift that you could give somebody else the gift of membership. So do have a look at the website. My talk is just about to finish, but if you'd like to find out more about Skills for Bees Cymru or any of the things I've mentioned, then do get in touch with me at Clare Flynn, clare.flynn@bumblebeeconservation.org, and I will be really, really happy to hear from you. Okay, thank you very much, and hopefully see you soon.